Good afternoon. My name is Charles Jennings. I'm director of the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York. And for some of you who may be unfamiliar with us, we are actually located in the city of New York. And we're very pleased today to have a guest from England, Professor John Drury from the University of Sussex, renowned social psychologist, and involved with a lot of very interesting work on crowd psychology, particularly for emergent and events. And so Professor Drury is at the end of his workday, so we're going to get started. He's going to have a presentation for us, and we will have a little time at the end for questions. For those of you who are new to the center, I'll send our web address out on the chat. All questions will come in through chat. Please remain muted and your video off. And if you have questions, I'll certainly be moderating those as we get to the end of the talk. But with that, I will turn it over to Professor Drury. And so thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Charles. I'll just start sharing my screen.
Looks good.
So, okay. So, yeah, thanks, Charles. So, as Charles said, I am a social psychologist. I'm at the University of Sussex. By being a social psychologist, what that means is I study the behavior of people in groups. And I've been applying social psychological theories to how people behave in emergencies for the past 20 years or so, studying that behavior within emergencies, and lately within events which turn out not to be emergencies, which are perceived as emergencies. And that is what I want to be talking to you about today. So just a few years ago now, there were in Europe a whole series of false alarm incidents across many cities in Europe. And these involved numbers of people in high streets thinking that a terrorist incident was taking place and suddenly running and fleeing and trying to get away from this incident. And some of these incidents were very distressing for those involved. They were also very disruptive, and some of them resulted in injuries and even fatalities. On the slide there, you can see an image from one of these false alarm incidents that took place in June 2017, when people had gathered to watch a Juventus game on a big screen. And some robbers tried to enact a robbery using pepper spray, and people in the crowd thought this was gunshots, and a number of them ran, and 3 people died in that incident. Now, one of the interesting features of this period, that is the last decade, at the same time as these false alarm flight incidents were occurring, there was another trend happening, which was a change in the mode of terrorist attacks. Because up to that time in Europe, terrorist attacks had taken the form of typically of explosives, suicide bombers, setting off bombs in crowded locations. But from the 2010 onwards, things started to change, with more unsophisticated, less sophisticated methods being used, such as vehicles and very often bladed weapons. So an individual would have a nice and easy to access weapon and simply attack people on the street. In addition, there were more firearms incidents as well, and I'm sure you were aware of some of these, some of the most notorious being, for example, the Bataclan attack in France in 2015. But there were a whole series of these. Now, the interest to me, one of the interests to me is this. There seemed to be a possible association between these two trends. I mean, they were kind of occurring at the same time, but there was little research on either of them in terms of public behavior. I mean, people, certainly in the media, claimed to understand what was happening with these false alarms. It was public panic. It was a new mood of irrationality in the public, but no research had actually been carried out on them, and no research too on public behavior in response to these new forms of terrorist incidents. Because although we had a long history, certainly in Europe, of bombing attacks. We had the IRA in the 70s and 80s, and there was research evidence on that. There was no evidence, really, little research evidence on how people might respond to these new forms of hostile threats. So these understanding these public behavior in response to these incidents was of interest to me, not only for theoretical reasons as an academic social psychologist, but I would suggest too that we need to understand public behavior in these kinds of incidents, these false alarms. We need to understand public behavior in them for two very good practical reasons too. Because when authorities, when those involved in civil contingencies prepare for possible incidents, they make assumptions about how the public behave, and they need to have accurate understanding of public behavior and up-to-date knowledge about public behavior too. Because if they work with inaccurate understandings of public behavior, that can actually be dangerous and even counterproductive. And just to give you one small example, it used to be the orthodoxy, and in some places, I suppose it still is, that we don't tell the public about a threat. We don't tell the public that there might be a fire in a certain building. We just tell them to get out, or we don't tell them anything. We don't tell them because they might panic. Now that received wisdom actually led to inefficient, ineffective evacuations, anxiety in the public, and risked creating fatalities. So by increasing our understanding of how the public actually do behave, we can not only develop more up-to-date social psychological models of behavior, we can also inform policymakers and practitioners and help them have more up-to-date understandings underlying what they do and recommend. So in order to take this forward, I led a research program, a funded research program that addressed this question of how the public behave and why they behave as they do in these false alarms. How do false alarms occur and what happens in them? This was funded by the ESRC, which is one of our main social science funders in the UK. And there were a large number of universities involved. You can see them on the slide there. And this was a very large program of research, £1 million program that included a whole series of different types of studies, including virtual reality experiments, because of course it's quite difficult to carry out experiments on these unpredictable incidents. So we used virtual reality techniques. We gathered CCTV data on an actual marauding knife attack incident and analysed that. And we carried out historical case studies of actual incidents in the past. So all those studies were part of this program, but the two I'm going to focus on in this presentation today are two other ones. And one of them is a review of incidents that took place, false alarm incidents that took place in Great Britain in that 10-year period, all the incidents and what happened in them. And secondly, a case study of the biggest of these incidents in the UK in that period, which is the Oxford Street false alarm, which took place in November 2017. So first of all, I'm going to address this question of when and why do these false alarm flight incidents occur? When does it happen that people in a crowd start running from what they think is a terrorist attack? And secondly, how do people actually behave in these incidents? We might imagine we know how they behave. They simply run and trample each other, but is that the case? And thirdly, then I shall move on to some recommendations based on this research for policy and practice. So first of all, then, when and why do these false alarm incidents occur? Now, why that's a fascinating question for people like me, social psychologists and other social scientists who look at public behavior in emergencies and disasters more generally, is we already know that underreaction, people delaying their response, people underestimating risk is really, really common. In fact, it's one of the major sources of fatalities and injuries and emergencies going wrong. People typically discount signals of threat. So, for example, I don't know where you are now, but imagine you're sitting in your office at work and the fire alarm goes off. What are you going to do? So I can't see your responses there, but I can imagine that you might hesitate, you might pause, right? Because that's what happens, isn't it? We don't immediately react. That's what we're told to do. If you have fire warden training, you're told that's what you should be doing, but we don't do that, right? So it's really, really common to underreact to these potential signals of threat. And so this is well established, and this has been well researched, and it's been identified not only across fire alarms, but across floods, hurricanes, and other warnings of impending hazard. And Leach pointed out that a minority of people just freeze in many emergencies. They just simply react in a kind of dysfunctional way by not responding at all. But what we're talking about here is a much more common, widespread response. The majority of people in many potential incidents seem to deny that there's actually a threat. And certainly there is a period before they respond appropriately. And this is sometimes characterized as a kind of cognitive bias. There is this desire to deny that the threat is happening, to carry on as normal. I mean, what's interesting, of course, is the examples I started with of people reacting to a threat that isn't actually there tell against this being a fixed bias of human cognition. So we need to understand this, because existing explanations for how people process potential threat signals don't seem to be able to explain these false alarm responses. So what we did, first of all, in this program of work was we tried to identify some of the objective predictors of when these false alarms occur. So we carried out a systematic review of all the incidents that we could find in Great Britain, which is England, Wales, and Scotland, in that 10-year period when there seemed to be prima facie many of them occurring. And we identified them through a search of a news database, quite a comprehensive database. And through appropriate search strings, we identified 630 news articles talking about incidents, and there were 126 incidents mentioned of false alarms. In 26 of these false alarms, there was evidence of members of the public actually running. It was mentioned in the news reports, or it was included in some of the videos that went along with these news reports, because this evidence then included not just textual descriptions of people running or people fleeing or false alarms, but sometimes videos where people could be seen running or walking or whatever. So what we tried to do then was correlate or show a possible association between the occurrence of these events and things out in the real world, right? So I've already indicated that there was a change in the form of terrorist incidents. There were many terrorist incidents in this period. So the first hypothesis, if you like, then, is that false alarms are more likely when there are real incidents happening. So this figure here shows some of our analyses. So I want you to look, first of all, at the orange line at the bottom, which, as you can see, peaks in 2017. And then the blue line in the middle, which also peaks in 2017. These are the false alarms. The blue one being the less urgent one, the more common, and the orange one being the one where people are running. So what we discovered, first of all, was these false alarms, these rises in false alarms, were only partially correlated, partially associated with the number of terrorist attacks in the UK, so in Great Britain, sorry, and they're only partially correlated with the magnitude of these terrorist incidents, which means the number of people killed in these incidents. So it was a patchy correlation, and you can also see from the red line at the top. The red line at the top is the official threat level set by the government. And you can see again, there is only a partial relationship. Although the threat level is very high at the same point at which the false alarms are high, which is 2017, you can see there's a spike in false alarms in 2013, but the threat level comes down. So again, only a partial association. However, when we looked at the nature of the terrorist incidents, we found a much stronger relation. And you can see the black line is the number of deaths across Europe from Islamist-inspired terrorism. And the red line at the bottom is the number of non-Islamist inspired terrorism. So what's going on is that the non-Islamist inspired terrorism, which includes the large terrorist attack in Norway in 2011, has no relationship with false alarms, but the terrorist attacks that were seen as psychologically relevant, so Islamist inspired attacks in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain and Europe, were the ones that predicted were associated with the rise in false alarms. So in some sense, people seem to be seeing those kind of attacks as relevant, and they're the ones they seem to be more likely to interpret harmless signals as threats. So it doesn't seem to be a cognitive bias then. It seems to be something associated realistically with threat. And when we looked at where the false alarms were taking place, looking at first the types of locations, so you can see at the top of this table, the locations where false alarms were most likely, whether non-urgent or urgent, to take place, were transport hubs and shopping centres and airports. Where are terrorist attacks most likely to take place? Transport hubs, shopping centres, airports. So there seems to be a realistic appraisal, in a sense, of where terrorist attacks were most likely to take place, and that was associated with where the false alarms were going to take place. And then looking at the cities where false alarms are most likely, the two cities where they were most likely, surprise, surprise, were London and Manchester, which were the two cities which had seen the most terrorist attacks in the UK. So we can say, on the basis of this analysis so far, that these false alarm incidents are not random. They occur in a pattern which it can be predicted by objective factors, both the location and the prior likelihood of terrorist attacks which are psychologically relevant. So now moving on to our case study, and still addressing this question of when and why false alarms occur, but this time trying to get at the subjective understanding of those involved, rather than just looking at objective predictors. So this incident was a very large incident which took place in London 2017, and it was widely characterized in the media as a meaningless mass panic of people behaving unreasonably. So to investigate this incident, we spoke to nearly 40 people who were present and involved in the incident, but we also gathered a large amount of archive material, videos, news articles, contemporaneous tweets. We had meetings with Transport for London. We saw their CCTV. We tried to put together an objective, a consensual account of what actually happened, the contours of the event, the sequence of events over time. So just to let you know very briefly what happened, the first incident that set off the false alarm was a fight between two men on Oxford Circus Underground station, which is one of the busiest stations in London, on Black Friday, which is the busiest shopping day of the year, November 2017. So when this scuffle started, people moved away from the incident, and then people started phoning the police and saying, we think there's a terrorist incident. We think the shots have been fired. Now, both the police and London Transport both knew that there hadn't been shots in this early period. They knew that it wasn't a shooting incident. But soon there were so many reports from members of the public saying there was a shooting incident that the police then felt obliged to respond, because they started to think maybe there was a terrorist incident. So a few minutes later, they sent an armed police response to the same area. Then Transport for London closed Oxford Circus and Bond Street, which was the second nearest tube station. They closed both of these stations, and they said they were investigating a customer incident, and they evacuated those stations. So people started flowing onto the streets. Hundreds of people fled from Oxford Circus station onto the street. People started moving down the street. The police started telling people to hide in shops. And more than 20 minutes after the initial incident, a well-known pop star, this is just one thing that happened, tweeted from Selfridge's famous department store, some distance away from the original incident, saying that he had heard gunshots in the shop. And this tweet of his was one of a number of tweets that were widely circulated. The police themselves circulated a tweet saying they were responding to the incident as if it was terror related. So more people further down and further away from the initial incident started getting involved. They started running too. They went into shops. People already in shops were locked in those shops by shop workers. And the police were continuing to tell people to go into shops 45 minutes later. However, 1.5 hours later, the police eventually concluded, after they and the fire service and others had arrived on the street, that there was no terrorist incident at all, and they stood down their operation. So we, first of all, were interested in whether those people who we interviewed, who were present at the time, was it in their minds that there was a threat of terrorism? Were they thinking about the threats of terrorism, this context of terrorism, when they started running, when they started trying to understand what was happening around them? And by the way, only a couple of the people that we interviewed said they heard shots. So most people didn't say they heard shots. But almost everybody we spoke to said, yes, they were aware that there was a heightened threat of terrorism. They weren't aware of the official threat level, but there had been 4 genuine incidents of terrorism in London that year. Westminster Bridge, London Bridge, Finsbury Park, Parsons Green, as well as the Manchester Arena bombing earlier that year. So there had been these genuine incidents. And when people talked about what had happened, when they said, yes, there had been such and such an incident, they were more likely to refer to these Islamist-inspired incidents, because all those incidents I mentioned, the only one that wasn't Islamist-inspired was Finsbury Park, and people didn't talk about that. And people also said, well, yeah, I thought, given it was this busiest time of the year, given Oxford Circus, it's a likely target. So people felt that Oxford Circus would be a likely target too. So just a quote here from one of the people. It's something that living in London, you're always quite aware of and worried about. And I think, particularly the London Bridge incident, which had happened a few months before, I would often, as a bridge, I would often cross. And I think, you are aware of it. I'd say it's not something I'm worried about on a daily basis, but a real understanding that, there is always going to be a terror threat in London as the capital, and you have to be aware that something might happen. So people thought that it was a likely place where something could happen. They were using this as a framing for interpreting what they saw around them, and they thought other people thought that as well. But most people, as I said, did not hear the sound of shots. Most people, what they saw, the first thing that they saw that made them think there was a terrorist incident happening was other people running. And in fact, this is important for understanding how this incident spread, because it wasn't just a small number of people running from a sound. It was a large number of people who responded to other people responding to something. And this is sometimes talked about. I mean, it was talked about in the media as a contagion, as if it's a mindless thing, as if people are just simply unthinkingly responding behaviorally to seeing others running. But it was a much more critical, thoughtful process than that. People were considering others' running behavior in the context of being aware of this genuine terrorist threat in London, in the UK at the time. And so some people did hear, were told, oh, there's something happening, but most of them were responding, as I said, to the sight of other people running and drawing, you might say, understandable conclusions from the sight of people running. So somebody says, the first thing I became aware of, something amiss, was people running, maybe 15 people running at speed, looking panicked, and some of them dashed into the restaurant. So our immediate thought was, there's a fight or a crime or a terrorist incident. Obviously, people started asking, what's going on? What's going on? And the people running were just clueless. They were just running because everyone else was running, and then they ducked out. So people are certainly asking what was going on and assuming the worst. But it wasn't only other members of the public, of course, that people saw. People also saw the police. They saw the police turning up with these weapons, which is not normal on the London streets. So there were kind of mixed feelings about this and mixed reactions too, because on the one hand, people thought this was reassuring if they already thought there was a threat. But if they hadn't known there was a threat and they suddenly saw the police, then they were thinking, oh no, there's something really serious happening now, and that made them alarmed. So obviously not copying the behavior of the police, so obviously not a contagion process again, much more a kind of appraisal process where they're thinking, well, what's going on here, and drawing conclusions, well, there must be something serious. A couple of the people we spoke to, though, actually misperceived the police as the terrorists, because the police were clad all in black. They barged into one of the shops shouting, and so some people thought this was the terrorist attack. And so that is something, that misperception, further misperception, is something I'll come back to a bit later. I think it's quite important too to emphasize two things here: that people concluded there was a terrorist incident occurring from a combination of factors. It wasn't just the sound, it wasn't just the sight of people running. They put together a whole series of bits of evidence before they concluded that there was a terrorist incident, before they started running. And so our impression from hearing about these false alarm flights in the news might be that people are very impulsive. They're just running at the sight of anything. They're very jumpy. But what you seem to have, at least in our evidence, is an initial period of discounting, of hesitation, of thinking, just like you get in many genuine emergencies, where, as I said earlier, people tend to not respond immediately, but hesitate. So that was the first question then, what predicts these? Why do these incidents occur? And I now want to move on to what we know about how people actually behave during these incidents. And they're going to contextualize this first by talking about what we know about how people behave in genuine emergencies, emergencies more general, not just hostile threats, because there's a lot of evidence now, after 50 or 60 years of social scientists studying behavior in these incidents, about how people actually behave. And the first thing to point out is the notion of starburst, that people simply move away in a kind of regular pattern from a threat, from an incident, is an oversimplification. I've already said that people delay their evacuation, they delay for various reasons, but they also attempt to flee in groups. They don't simply scatter as individuals. They try to stay in their groups, groups of friends, groups of family members, sometimes with strangers too. And the other pattern that we know about behavior in emergencies in general is that cooperation between people and help between them is very common, much more common than you might imagine from some of the images and some of the stereotypes of public behavior in emergencies and disasters. And I've got two, and these are not hostile threat incidents on the slide there. These are two different kinds of disasters, crushing disasters. And the reason I wanted to mention these is because even in these incidents where it's physically difficult for people to help each other because they're being crushed, even in these incidents, the studies of these incidents, and I was involved in a study where we interviewed survivors from Hillsborough, even in these crushing incidents, people tried to help each other, right? And people had an impulse to help each other. So it's very strong, this impulse to try to help other people in emergencies. So moving back to hostile threats, I just want to say a bit more about why this helping happens before I move back to our false alarms to understand what happened there and why there was helping or why there wasn't helping. So I want to tell you, spend a few minutes telling you about a terrorist incident that happened in London in 2005, a genuine terrorist incident. It was 4 suicide bombers on the London Underground and on a train, on a bus. 56 people died, including the terrorists, and there were over 700 injuries. And the people who survived and were dying were left in the underground in the dark, literally and figuratively, for a period of time before the emergency services got to them. So we interviewed survivors. We gathered testimonies from survivors, from the official inquiry, from many archive sources. So we had a large number of sources, and we looked at what people witnessed, what they did, and we also looked at some of the motivations and some of the psychological processes underlying this. And we found there was extensive evidence of cooperation and help amongst people. So people were tying tourniquets, people were doing more mundane things like sharing bottles of water, they were trying to lift others up, they were letting others go in front of them as they tried to evacuate. There was some selfish pushing behavior amongst some of the survivors reported, but much less of that was reported than cooperative behavior. And what's interesting and important in theoretical and in practical terms about this pattern of behavior is that this was a crowd of people with very little prior connections with each other. If you look at disaster planning, they often say, well, you need to have social capital, you need to have an established community, you need to have connections between people. That is the basis of resilience in communities. And if you think about planning for floods, it's all around that notion of building the community and building a flood group in preparedness. But these people were strangers, because this emergency took place, this terrorist attack took place during rush hour. There were people on their way to work. Very few of them knew the people they were with. And of course, this is important because many such terrorist incidents in crowded places take place on crowds of people who are with strangers. Maybe they're with friends and family as well, but they're amongst strangers. So we asked, how is it then that people who don't know each other might start behaving as if they do and being supportive to each other, taking the risk of spending time helping when they could be looking after number one and simply escaping? What happens? And on the basis of this study and a number of other studies, a number of other emergencies and disasters we looked at, including some natural hazards, earthquakes, and crushes, we put forward this model. And at the heart of this model is a thing called shared social identity, which means the sense that other people are part of the same group as me, that other people here are an us or a we. And this social identity, this sense of being a group, arises in emergencies and disasters where there is a common fate, where the emergency groups people together. Some of our people at the London bombings talked about, we're all in the same boat, we've been grouped together. And that made them see others as us. And when you see others as an us or a we, you start to care more about what happens to them. You become motivated to assist them, to give them help. You also are more likely to expect help from them, because if they're in my group, they would care. If they're part of an us or a we, they would care about what happens to me. And if you expect support, if you expect certain kinds of behavior from others, you're more likely to be able to coordinate your behavior with them and act as one. And this is why you very often see coordinated, cooperative behavior amongst people in all sorts of crowds, but in these kind of crowds where people are in a novel situation, spontaneously organizing themselves. Now, I wasn't the first to say this by any means. This has been an argument of researchers in emergencies and disasters going back over 50 years. But these kinds of this kind of evidence, this evidence of widespread cooperation, is one of the reasons why researchers in this field have abandoned the idea of panic, despite the fact that we are told by the mass media that what happens in emergencies and in false alarms is a form of panic. Cooperation is so common that it can't be that people lose control as a kind of default. In addition to the fact that, what counts, how do you decide what counts as reasonable behavior? I mean, the notion of panic implies that behavior is unreasonable, is irrational, but to judge that in an emergency where information is limited is a difficult thing. So the panic concept has largely been abandoned by social scientists. So certainly what happened, as I said, in Oxford Street back in 2017, and all these false alarms in this period have been discussing were certainly characterized as mass panic, not only in terms of people's judgment about threat and risk, but also in terms of how they behaved. People were characterized as running pell-mell, as trampling each other. How did they actually behave? So our review of incidents in the 2010s period was able to count how many behaviors were reported as occurring. And because we had video evidence too, we could count and compare video evidence and textual evidence, reported evidence, written evidence. And there was a difference between those two pieces of evidence. I won't go into that now, but I think the main message I want to get across is the sheer diversity of behaviors in these false alarms. Yes, certainly people ran, but others walked without much urgency. Others stopped and filmed, as you might expect. Others tried to investigate the reason for the thing that had started the false alarm. But there was also other information, other behaviors, sharing information, returning to shops and properties, hiding, gathering outside venues, as well as instances of people mutually coordinating and helping each other. There were incidents of competitive behaviors such as pushing and trampling, but we found that in fewer than half of the incidents, half of the events. So addressing the same question in the Oxford Street false alarm, again, a diversity of behaviors was observed. People ran, but they also hid. Lots of people hid, of course. Some people already in shops. People were seeking information. People were helping others. Many people were carrying on as normal. Lots of people got their phones out, and many of our interviewees were irritated by that. So a diversity of behavior. So a few more quotes here, people talking about not everybody ran. It wasn't just running. And I just want to spend a few moments then, finally, on this question of behaviour to understand why cooperative behaviour wasn't as common as in incidents such as the London bombings. Because, as I said a few slides ago, cooperative behaviour was reported very, very commonly at that terrorist incident and at many other emergencies and disasters I've looked at. And it is notable how less common cooperative behaviour was in the Oxford Circus false alarm, and how more common pushing and other competitive behaviour was. It certainly wasn't overwhelming, but there was a clear difference between these two incidents. Why was that? An obvious difference between Oxford Street and the London bombings and the other genuine emergencies is that in the genuine emergencies, there was this common fate whereby people felt positioned together by the clearly evident thing that they all faced. One of the features of the experience of Oxford Street for people was the sheer lack of a common experience, a sheer lack of a common understanding. People didn't agree on where the threat was coming from. They couldn't see where the threat was coming from. They could have understood each other as part of the threat. And you could see this in some of the video evidence of people weren't running from the same direction. People were sometimes running in opposite directions. They didn't have a common understanding of the threat. They didn't develop a common sense of we-ness. And the best evidence for we-ness, shared social identity, camaraderie, that kind of psychological unity, the best evidence of that typically occurred not in the streets, not in the crowd as a whole, but in those situations where people were grouped together, for example, in shop basements where they could construct a common experience. So to summarize the findings before I move on to the final couple of slides about recommendations, to summarize the findings then, we've argued in this evidence that it is that when there is a context of genuine terrorist incidents occurring, it can provide a framing for the public's perception of the signals that they hear as hostile threats. And in particular, it seems to be those psychologically relevant terrorist attacks and the particularly large psychologically relevant terrorist attacks, it's most predictive of people interpreting harmless signals as threats. And when this happens, then people start to see others' flight behavior as something they should join in with. So it's not mindless, it seems to be conditional upon that. And very often there is this discounting too. People aren't on a kind of hair trigger. They are, as with many genuine emergencies, they're hesitating at first. They're interpreting, they're thinking, they're arguing, they're looking for information. And so even when there's a false alarm incident that we've characterized as urgent with people running, there are often very many other behaviors too, including many people ignoring the threat, including people walking away, and including cooperation. And cooperation, it seems, is much less likely to occur in those incidents where no common fate is present, because in those cases there is no shared social identity. So let me move on to some recommendations, because we did this, we carried out and planned this work in conjunction with the UK Resilience Directorate, and some of the questions we addressed were to help them with their concerns in terms of planning. The first recommendation I would make to policymakers and practitioners is to embed what we know about the psychology of public behaviour in emergencies in your training and guidance. If you don't, your staff will make assumptions about how the public behave. And because normal public discourse is full of assumptions about crowd behavior, they will bring in assumptions about panic and disorder instead of the more nuanced picture that we are providing here. So your guidance needs to be informed by what we know about how the public actually behave in emergencies. Secondly, the magnitude of the false alarm on Oxford Street prompted a discussion about whether the authorities should be promoting vigilance so much in the public. And I guess it boils down to the costs and benefits, because certainly there was a cost to the Oxford Street false alarm. People were distressed. There was a very expensive emergency services response. Businesses were disrupted. But imagine if it was a real terrorist incident and the public were complacent about it, the public ignored the signals. What would have been the cost then? So I think, it's a judgment call for the authorities, but I would say we're not doing the wrong thing. We're not doing the wrong thing in promoting public vigilance about threats. But thirdly, how do you, if you're an authority, if you're a responder, how do you get the public to listen to what you say about threats? And here I would suggest that the authorities need to think about their long-term relationships with the public. There's something important about shared social identities, which I haven't mentioned so far, which is people are more likely to trust and listen to messages coming from people in their group than they are from messages from outside their group. So somehow the authorities need to position themselves as part of the same group as the public rather than an outside force. Then they will be listened to more when they try to promote messages around preparedness and vigilance. Fourth, what can we do about some of the problems in the false alarm incident in Oxford Street in 2017, where there wasn't a coordinated public response? There was a bit of trampling. It wasn't as cooperative and coordinated as some of the incidents that we've seen in the past. Well, one of the things the authorities could do to help promote a greater sense of unity within the public is to use a language that draws attention to our commonality and draws attention to the commonality between themselves and the public too. So talking about a we and an us rather than simply you, talking about the public collectively, these ways of talking can help promote the sense of unity within the crowd and between the crowd and the authorities. Fifthly, I mentioned that some of the public responded to seeing the police by thinking the police were the terrorists. And there's a very simple way to deal with that. I mean, the police should probably have something on their back and on their front to indicate that they were the police rather than just turning up in black. But in general, the authorities need to reflect upon how their actions might be perceived by the public. How do the public look at their behavior, and how will the public respond to that emotionally and psychologically? Because the authorities, the emergency responders, are not neutral. Their behaviors are interpreted by the public, and that interpretation can have behavioral consequences. And the final thing I want to mention is about emotional support, because when genuine and false alarms happen, there is distress. People in our interviews were distressed. They were distressed at the time. They were distressed and humiliated afterwards when people mocked their response. And so the authorities and responders want to give emotional response, right? And the advice here is don't say, stay calm, don't say, don't panic, all this kind of thing. This doesn't help. What helps people feel more emotionally better and less anxious is to give people practical advice. What can you do in this situation to be safe? Not advice on how to feel, but advice on what to do. So that is all I'm going to say for now. I hope that Charles is going to share with you the report, which covers these studies in a bit more detail, plus the other studies I talked about at the beginning. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, John, very much for that. And yes, everybody who should have gotten a link to the document of interest that we've been discussing. And so we'll be happy to take any questions via chat. And we've got about another 10 minutes for questions. So please don't be shy. Get them up to me right now, and we'll get them answered. So, John, I think the one of the things to me is a somebody who's works in the emergency space is the you know I guess, could you characterize the challenges of doing this research, your empirical research, because we've had, just thinking back to your talk, of course, we've had these similar incidents right here in
Yeah.
New York City with the JFK airport back in 2017, and a similar one in Penn Station, railway terminal, and where, somebody was being tased and that people thought it was gunshots. And so, anyway, as a researcher, what are some of the challenges, and how was it that the funding regime there, came to support such kind of aggressive investigation
Aggressive.
of these kind of phenomena?
Thanks. Yeah, great question. I think the problem of investigating false alarm incidents is the same as the problem of investigating emergencies and disasters more generally. Actually, it's emergencies rather than disasters, right? Because it is that acute response phase. It's not the aftermath that I'm looking at here. It's behavior in that acute phase, which by its nature is unpredictable. Right. So then you've got epistemological issues of, isn't it always going to be post hoc? And if you're going to do some kind of experimental simulation, isn't that going to lack ecological validity? So you've got these kinds of questions, right? So then the answer to that in terms of data and evidence is to say, well, of course, every research method has its weaknesses as well as its strengths. And therefore, an answer is to combine multiple different methods. So you've got the subjective experience through interviewing people who were there, but you've also got some evidence, some objective evidence of the contours of the event by gathering multiple sources and video data. You can try to unpack cause and effect by doing experiments, and we did virtual reality experiments where we manipulated the sound, we manipulated the context, and measured people's avatars, whether they decided to run. We also analyzed CCTV footage. So I mean, in terms of the research method challenges, they were those. In terms of why and how you get funded for this, so our funder wants scientific knowledge. It wants a scientific contribution. Okay, so we try to develop a new model of this behavior, which brings together existing theories in a new framework. So that's the scientific contribution, and that is tested in the form of are you expected to get peer-reviewed journal articles out of it? But not only that, the funder expects this to be useful work as well, and hence, as I mentioned, we worked from the very beginning with that part of the UK government that deals with civil contingencies. What were their concerns? What did they want to know? And so they helped shape some of the questions, and we presented findings to them. And then we worked with responders too. We worked with the fire service. We worked with with Transport for London to share our knowledge with them too, and gave them some useful findings. So yeah, I hope answers that question. I see we've got a few more in the chat now.
That was a great response. Let me get these questions to you. The first one was from Adam. He says, I've worked in policing for 20 years and continue to hear basically the bad advice of, if you tell people too much, they'll just go into panic. And how can we ensure that this kind of research gets ingrained into the people, who are potentially could use it or misuse it? So what's the answer to that?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's two parts to that. First is training, and secondly is guidance. So in all the years I've been doing this, I've been trying to work closely with practitioners and getting any opportunity I can to speak. And the people that I work with, my students, will give presentations. And we have managed to embed some of it in the training. So some of our work on the responses to public behavior in chemical, biological, radiological incident decontamination. That now is embedded in the UK Fire and Rescue Service training. And when that training is carried out, we get the same questions as you. Aren't the public going to panic? So we go through the evidence in the training and we show that our methods of speaking to the public actually get better results. And they get better results from experiments and a whole series of different kinds of pieces of research we carried out. So embed it in the training. So have part of your training program to include psychology and the latest psychology, and then embed it in your guidance documents too, so that your guidance documents have it as part of the orthodoxy. Because if you don't, as I mentioned, if you don't, then these common sense assumptions will just sneak in. So yeah, that's my answer to that one.
Okay. I think the second question asked about kind of getting that. Okay, the question about potentially deploying highly visible units which reinforce the information. I guess, is there any evidence that they are building this? Okay, so essentially the same kind of question.
It's a different question, isn't it? It's about the role of the emergency services in increasing, and this is what happened. I mean, they have got a very difficult judgment call, okay? Because I said in the Oxford Street incident, the police knew initially it was not a terrorist attack, right? And then they had so many calls from the public that they started to believe it was, and they went in with a full anti-terrorist response. If they hadn't, remember, there had been 4 genuine terrorist attacks in London that year. So imagine they took the risk on the other side and said, well, let's discount it, right? What could have happened? They had to do something, right? And the risk then is, as they go in, they escalate, it cascades, doesn't it? Because people start seeing that, and it starts to become the false alarm that I've just described to you. I mean, there are things they could do to, I mean, there were mistakes, as I said, as in the way they didn't badge themselves properly. But I think, my advice, as I mentioned, is not that they shouldn't respond. Of course, they have to respond sometimes. They have to. It was understandable that they expected the worst. But to understand too, that in a context where there have been genuine terrorist attacks, people are more likely to interpret signals in this way. I mean, that is the question. When are we going to get? How are the public going to respond? So let me say this, for example. If there was something similar happening today, like an incident on a tube platform where 2 people had a fight, and people started ringing the police and saying they thought it was a terrorist incident, my prediction is there wouldn't be a big cascading incident down Oxford Street. There wouldn't today, because there hasn't been a whole series of terrorist attacks in London this year. So yeah, that's my answer to that one.
Okay, and it looks like it may be our last question. This is someone who's writing from Portugal. They're saying they don't have a history of terrorist attacks. And so how can you raise awareness among populations to be aware of the issue? And culturally, it's a country without attacks. And so I guess it's the opposite problem from what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's the real problem, as I said, in the presentation, the real problem is the public responding too slowly to genuine threats. So those in authority need to make people aware. I mean, just talking about emergencies more generally, right? So David Cantor, some years ago, studied human behavior in fires and demonstrated that people underestimate how quickly fire moves, right? You work with the fire service, they say, okay, it's true that most alarms going off are false alarms, right? But get out anyway, right? Err on the side of caution. How do you get the public to think that way? It's really, really difficult, because the public will say, well, they are mostly, it is mostly a test when an alarm bell goes off. It is mostly a false alarm. They are right in a way to treat most signals as false alarms and ignore them. okay, which is what they tend to do. So it is going to be difficult for you. I mean, in the UK, I mentioned the official threat level and some of the campaigns. Most people on Oxford Street, at least judging by our interviewees, were not aware of that campaign. They were responding to the genuine attacks that had taken place, not to the awareness campaign. So you really do have a lot of work to do to raise public awareness. It's not easy at all. We have see it, save it, sort it on the trains, which is another public awareness campaign. I'm not sure how successful that is. It's really, really difficult. I don't have an easy answer for you, and particularly, as you say, because you haven't had a history of incidents, and so people can easily discount it and say, well, it's not going to happen. Why should I be prepared? I mean, the other example, of course, is floods. So we're trying to get people to be more prepared for floods, because floods, and we're becoming more aware of this, are much more likely. So you'd hope that more people are, joining flood groups and so on. But if there hasn't been a history of incidents, it's a really difficult thing to do to get people to be more aware.
Okay, I think that is our time. John, I thought that was a fantastic talk. And certainly the field is so salient to so much of what we do. And it's really refreshing to see your research supported and the great work that you're doing across a lot of different areas. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, you can look on the professor's page, and he's involved in a lot of other areas that are quite central to kind of problems of the day, including COVID mitigation and response and other issues. So thanks again, John. For those of you who have not been with us before, what we do is we'll circulate a link to the video in a few weeks via email, and you should also have a link to the report in your email message, in the email account that you used for signing up. So once again, thank you very much, Professor Drury.
Thanks. Cheers,
Okay.
then. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.
Cheers.